The world is not merely what it appears to be, it is a carefully woven illusion, a grand tapestry designed to soothe the restless mind and quiet dangerous questions. We are taught that history moves in a straight line, a steady march toward enlightenment and progress. But beneath the ashen silence of forgotten centuries lies a darkness so vast it has consumed even the memory of those who once lived within it. In those buried shadows survives the name Elizabeth Crowe, a woman whose existence was almost erased from the record, not through oversight, but through fear. The kind of fear that lingers in the bones of those who lived long enough to whisper about her. To speak her name even now is to feel a cold that does not belong to the present. Picture her moving through the thick midnight air of the southern fields, humidity clinging to the earth like a second skin. Fog parts at her approach. Her silhouette slices through the darkness with deliberate, chilling purpose. She was not a myth born around a campfire, nor a wandering spectre conjured by imagination. She was real, and the terror she left behind was real enough to be buried with intent. This is not just a story. This is another entry in the dark chronicle. She was flesh, blood, and a terrifyingly sharp intellect. Crowe didn't just inhabit the world of the 19th century. She dissected it, finding the cracks in human morality where she could plant the seeds of her own absolute dominion. She was an architect of a trade that society claimed to regulate, but she elevated the hunting and selling of human beings into a dark science, creating a blueprint of psychological corruption that continues to echo through the corridors of power today. Her story is not a comfortable journey. It is a descent into the realization that true evil does not always scream. It often whispers with a polite, calculated smile. Elizabeth Crowe was not a monster born from a void. She was a product of a world that nurtured cruelty behind masks of propriety. She grew up in a forgotten township, a place where the sun seemed to struggle against a perpetual gray, and where social standing was the only shield against the whims of the law. Her childhood was not a theater of warmth, but a rigorous curriculum in human indifference, with parents who were either absent or emotionally hollow and neighbors who practiced a judgmental silence. She learned early that vulnerability was a death sentence. In this fertile soil of neglect, her mind took root, developing an uncanny ability to perceive the hidden currents of fear in others. While other children played, Elizabeth watched. She studied the way the town's elite used their influence to silence the poor, and how the law could be bent with a whispered word or a well-placed coin. She realized that knowledge, specifically the kind of knowledge that people desperately wanted to keep hidden, was the ultimate currency. By the time she reached adolescence, she had already mastered the subtle art of manipulation. She knew that a well-timed rumor could be as lethal as a blade, and that true power was seized, never again. She didn't seek to belong to the society she saw. She sought to master its hidden mechanics, turning her observations into a shadowed apprenticeship in the anatomy of human domination. As she matured, Elizabeth's experiments in control became more sophisticated and far more sinister. She didn't begin with the grand machinery of the slave trade. She started small, testing the boundaries of submission on the helpless creatures and people within her immediate reach. Whether it was the servants in her household or the stray animals in the woods, she applied pressure with surgical precision, observing exactly when a spirit would break and when it would merely bend. These were not impulsive acts of violence, but cold, calculated research. She was mapping the human psyche, learning how trauma could be layered to produce a specific result: absolute obedience. She noticed that physical pain was a blunt instrument, one that often invited rebellion, but psychological terror was an invisible chain that the victim would eventually forge for themselves. She watched the local merchants, the plantation owners, and the sheriffs, absorbing their methods of authority and refining them into something far more potent. She saw how they used the threat of the other to keep their populations in check, and she realized that if she could become the source of that threat, omnipresent yet unseen, she could dictate the reality of everyone around her. She was preparing for a life where people were not individuals but pieces on a chessboard of her own making. The precision of her methods was what set her apart from the common predators of her era. Elizabeth Crowe was a meticulous record-keeper of human weakness. She didn't just hunt. She catalogued. Before she ever moved against a target, she would spend weeks, sometimes months, observing their routines, their alliances, and their deepest fears. She understood that everyone has a breaking point, a hidden hinge upon which their entire identity turns. Nothing escaped her scrutiny, not a parent's love for a child, nor a servant's secret hope for escape. She saw these emotions not as virtues, but as handles she could use to pull people into her web. She maintained a perfect mask of social grace, a charming veneer of a lady of standing that allowed her to move through high society while her hands were metaphorically stained with the soot of her trade. This duality was her greatest weapon. By appearing respectable, she was able to lure confidences and mask her intentions until it was far too late for her prey to flee. She rewrote the rules of engagement, blending society's expectations with her own ruthless strategy. In her world, morality was a fairy tale for the weak, and law was merely a set of obstacles to be circumvented through cunning and influence. By the time Elizabeth Crowe stepped fully into the shadows of the human trade, she was no longer just a participant. She was a visionary of fear. She understood that to truly own a person, one must first dismantle their sense of self. Her operations were not characterized by chaotic raids, but by inevitable disappearances. She mapped fear in real time, pushing the limits of what a community would tolerate before it began to police its own members out of sheer dread. This was the moment the darkness crystallized, the emergence of a predator who didn't just want to capture bodies, but to colonize the minds of the helpless. Her legacy was not built on the number of chains she forged, but on the number of wills she broke. As you contemplate her rise, remember that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who understand the architecture of your own mind better than you do. She was the silent force that turned the world into a labyrinth of invisible rules where any step out of line could summon a terror that left no trace. This was the birth of a legend, a whispered story designed to break the spirit of entire regions before a single lash was ever drawn. Her story is a lesson in the terrifying potential of a mind dedicated to the mastery of human weakness. The transition from a student of cruelty to a master of systemic domination required more than just malice. It required an organizational genius that the world was unprepared to face. Elizabeth Crowe understood that the physical act of capture was merely the final step in a much longer, more intricate process of psychological erosion. She began to operate not as a common kidnapper, but as a cold-blooded engineer of human despair. Her operations were characterized by a chilling silence that defied the loud, violent norms of the era. Crowe did not need a small army to enforce her will. She used the existing structures of society as her primary tools. She began by mapping out the social and emotional geography of the regions she targeted. She didn't just look for vulnerable people. She looked for the gaps in their support systems. She studied the paths where the law didn't reach, the communities where a missing person would be written off as a runaway, and the families whose internal fractures made them easy to manipulate. To Crowe, every human relationship was a potential leverage point. She was an invisible architect building a framework of fear that was so integrated into the daily lives of the local population that people began to accept the disappearances as a natural, if terrifying, part of their environment. One of Crowe's most terrifying innovations was the weaponization of anticipation. She realized that the mind is its own worst enemy when faced with an undefined threat. Instead of striking quickly, she would linger in the periphery of a community's consciousness for weeks. A stray shadow seen near a worker's cabin, a strange mark left on a gate, or a series of cryptic rumors planted in the local tavern. These were the bricks she used to build her psychological prison. By the time she actually moved to seize a target, the individual was often already paralyzed by a sense of inevitability. She didn't just take people. She made them feel as though they had already been taken. This method ensured that resistance was minimal. When the physical chains were finally applied, they felt like a formality compared to the mental shackles she had already forged. Her surgical precision meant that she never left a trace that could lead back to her directly. She utilized a network of informants who didn't even realize they were working for her. People who traded snippets of information for small favors, unknowingly feeding the predator the data she needed to select her next victim. Crowe's facility for control extended deep into the mechanics of identity. She understood that to make a human being truly submissive, you must first strip away the anchors of their soul. When she captured individuals, her first act was not one of violence, but of profound psychological disorientation. She would move her captives through a series of liminal spaces, basement, hidden forest camps, and windowless wagons where time and location became meaningless. She used sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and calculated bursts of kindness to fracture the captive's sense of reality. By the time a person reached her final holding area, they had often lost their sense of name, origin, and hope. She wasn't just selling labor, she was selling broken wills. This process was so effective that many of her victims stopped trying to escape even when the doors were left unlocked. They had been convinced that Crow was omnipresent, that her eyes were everywhere, and that the world outside her control no longer existed. This was the Crow method, a dark curriculum in human dismantling that she refined with every new shipment of souls she sent into the void. The genius of her architectural approach lay in how she managed her public persona alongside her secret atrocities. While she was orchestrating the erasure of entire families, Elizabeth Crow was often seen attending the most prestigious social functions in the region. She would sit at dinner tables with the very judges and sheriffs who were tasked with investigating the mysterious disappearances that plagued the area. She used these interactions to gather intelligence, subtly steering conversations to find out which areas were being patrolled or which investigators were getting too close to the truth. She was a master of the polite mask, using her charm to disarm suspicion and her wealth to buy the silence of those who might have otherwise spoken out. Her social standing served as a fortress, a high wall of respectability that blocked any attempt to peer into the darkness of her true trade. She understood that society rarely looks for monsters among the elegant and the refined by dressing her evil in silk and speaking in the measured tones of the aristocracy. She made her crimes invisible to those who were conditioned to only fear the unrefined criminal. Ultimately, Part 2 reveals Crow not as a villain of impulse, but as a strategist of the highest order. She recognized that the most efficient way to manage a large-scale system of oppression was to make the victims participate in their own containment. She created hierarchies within her captive groups, rewarding those who informed on others and brutally punishing collective defiance. This turned the oppressed against each other, ensuring that no unified resistance could ever form. She was the silent engineer of a machine that ran on human fear and social compliance. Her legacy in this phase of her life was the creation of an economy of terror where human lives were liquidated with the same cold detachment one might use for agricultural ledgers. She had elevated the trade of human beings into a dark art form, proving that with enough psychological insight and strategic patience, one woman could cast a shadow over an entire civilization. She didn't just follow the rules of the dark world she inhabited. She rewrote them, creating a legacy of invisible control that would haunt the landscape for centuries to come. The true horror of Elizabeth Crow's ascendancy lay not in her ability to evade the law, but in her capacity to inhabit and corrupt it. She realized that a predator operating outside the law is eventually hunted down, but a predator who becomes the law is immortal. Part 3 of our descent explores the system of shadows, the period where Crow stopped avoiding the structures of civilization and began to rewire them to serve her dark purposes. She understood that every society, no matter how ostensibly moral, is built upon a foundation of administrative vulnerabilities, greed, and the desire for order. She began to target the pillars of local stability, the magistrate's office, the counting houses, and the church vestries. Her approach was subtle. She didn't use overt bribery which left a trail of evidence, but rather a sophisticated form of mutual obligation. She would provide high-interest loans to struggling lawmen, or offer insider information to ambitious merchants, effectively turning the community's leaders into silent partners in her enterprise. By the time these men realized the nature of Crow's trade, they were already too entangled in her web to extract themselves without inviting their own ruin. She had created a silent consensus where the preservation of her business became synonymous with the preservation of their own reputations. This institutional infiltration turned the geography of the region into a series of blind spots where the law simply ceased to exist. When families reported a missing loved one, the paperwork would mysteriously vanish between the sheriff's desk and the judge's chambers. Witnesses who dared to come forward were met with a wall of polite skepticism from the very officials meant to protect them. Crow had successfully weaponized the bureaucracy against the people it was designed to serve. She used her legal and social connections to create a legitimate front for her operations, registering her transport wagons as merchant fleets and her holding pens as agricultural storage units. This administrative camouflage meant that even if a suspicious passer-by saw something untoward, the records would show nothing but standard commerce. She was the master of the paper trail that leads nowhere, ensuring that her atrocities were buried under layers of mundane filing and legal jargon. To the casual observer, Elizabeth Crow was merely a savvy businesswoman and a pillar of the community. While beneath the surface, she was the primary engine of the region's most terrifying human extraction network. Crow's manipulation of the justice system was matched by her calculated exploitation of religious and moral hierarchies. She understood that in the 19th century, the pulpit held more power over the human mind than the gavel. She became a prominent benefactor of local churches, donating large sums to charities and orphanages to project an image of saintly compassion. This was not irony, it was strategy. By positioning herself as a moral guardian, she made it socially impossible for anyone to accuse her of the crimes she was committing. Anyone who spoke out against her was not just attacking a woman, but attacking a friend of the faith and a protector of the poor. She used this moral shield to silence dissent before it could even form. In her private journals, if they had ever been found, she likely laughed at the ease with which she could buy a community's soul with a few gold coins and a front row seat at Sunday service. She had successfully created a world where the victims were not only physically captured, but were also morally isolated, with no higher power to turn to for help, because the higher powers of their world were already in her pocket. The economic reach of her system of shadows also extended into the very fabric of local commerce. Crow ensured that her operations were beneficial to the town's bottom line. She used local blacksmiths to forge her chains, local farmers to provide the meager rations for her captives, and local teamsters to drive her wagons. By spreading the financial spoils of her trade throughout the community, she turned the entire town into an unwitting accomplice. People who suspected the truth often chose to look the other way, because their own livelihoods had become dependent on the anonymous contracts that Crow's front companies provided. She was effectively laundering her evil through the local economy, making it so that the collapse of her empire would mean the financial ruin of the township. This created a profound psychological barrier to justice. The townspeople didn't just fear her, they needed her. She had built a fortress not of stone and mortar but of shared guilt and economic necessity. This was the ultimate form of control, making the world you are oppressing believe that your survival is essential to their own. As Part 3 concludes, we see Elizabeth Crow not as a solitary ghost in the cotton fields, but as the director of a vast invisible machine. She had successfully blurred the lines between the underworld and the upper world until they were indistinguishable. Her genius lay in her understanding that systemic evil is far more durable than individual cruelty. By embedding her trade within the legitimate functions of society, she made herself untouchable. She proved that if you can control the records, the money, and the morals of a community, you can commit any atrocity in broad daylight and be thanked for your service to civilization. This phase of her life serves as a chilling blueprint for how power can be concentrated in the shadows of proper institutions. It reminds us that the most dangerous forces in history are often those that hold the keys to the courtrooms and the ledgers of the banks. Elizabeth Crow was no longer just a woman. She was the system itself, a predatory architecture that functioned with the cold, unfailing precision of a clock, ticking away the lives of the helpless behind a mask of perfect polite order. The most enduring legacy of Elizabeth Crow was not the wealth she amassed or the individuals she sold, but the psychological virus she planted within the collective consciousness of the region she touched. Part 4 examines the contagion of fear, a stage where her influence became so pervasive that it no longer required her physical presence to enforce obedience. Crow had mastered the art of making terror hereditary. She understood that if you break a parent's spirit in front of a child, you don't just control the parent, you colonize the child's future. In the communities she dominated, fear became an ambient condition like the weather or the soil. People began to police themselves, filtering their thoughts and silencing their neighbors before a single word of dissent could reach the ears of Crow's informants. This was the ultimate realization of her architecture of fear. The chains were no longer made of iron. They were made of the internalized whispers of a population that had been taught that safety lay only in invisibility and absolute compliance. This contagion operated through the deliberate dismantling of trust, the very fabric that holds a society together. Crow engineered situations where loyalty was a liability and suspicion was a survival trait. She would often plant false victims, individuals who appeared to be captured, but were actually her eyes and ears within the captive groups, or the town's lower quarters. When a real attempt at escape or rebellion was planned, it would be met with swift, devastating retribution that seemed almost supernatural in its timing. This led the community to believe that Crow possessed an omnipresent godlike awareness. Neighbors began to look at one another not with empathy but with a cold, calculating dread, wondering which of them would be the next to trade a secret for a night of safety. By turning the oppressed into each other's jailers, Crow ensured that no unified front could ever rise against her. The psychological isolation she imposed was more effective than any wall, creating a fractured society where the only commonality was a shared, silent submission to her unseen will. The impact on the children of these communities was perhaps the most chilling aspect of her reign. Growing up in the shadow of Crow's legend, An entire generation learned that the world was a place of arbitrary cruelty where the polite were the most dangerous. They learned to interpret the silence of their elders as a manual for survival. This created a culture of inherited caution where the trauma of the past was encoded into the behavior of the future. Even in households that had not been directly hit by her trade, the stories of the woman in the fields were used as a tool of discipline, a way to keep children from wandering or speaking to strangers. Crow had successfully integrated herself into the folklore of the region, transforming from a criminal into a dark archetype. This ensured that even if she were to vanish tomorrow, the patterns of behavior she had established, the quickness to obey, the fear of the dark, the distrust of authority would persist for decades, shaping the social and psychological landscape of the region for generations to come. As the contagion spread, it began to affect the very perception of reality. Crow used the system of shadows to manipulate information so thoroughly that the truth became a matter of perspective rather than fact. She understood that if you control the narrative, you control the soul. She would seed rumors that were intentionally contradictory, creating a state of informational exhaustion where the public simply gave up on trying to understand what was real. One day, a missing person was said to have run away to the north. The next, they were rumored to have taken a job in a distant city. By keeping the community in a constant state of uncertainty, she prevented the formation of the moral outrage necessary for a revolution. People cannot fight what they cannot define. This psychological blurring was a deliberate tactic to ensure that her operations remained in a state of perpetual ambiguity, allowing her to move through the world as a ghost, while her influence functioned with the weight of an anchor. Part 4 concludes with the realization that Elizabeth Crow had achieved a form of immortality through trauma. She had turned an entire region into a laboratory of submission, proving that human beings can be conditioned to accept the unthinkable if the pressure is applied with enough consistency and subtlety. Her contagion of fear serves as a stark warning about the fragility of the human psyche when faced with a predator who understands the mechanics of the mind. She didn't just want to be feared. She wanted to be the very definition of reality for those she oppressed. As we move toward the final chapter of this descent, we must recognize that the shadows she cast were not limited to the 19th century. The methods she perfected, the dismantling of trust, the weaponization of uncertainty, and the institutionalization of trauma are blueprints that remain active in the world today, waiting for the next architect to pick them up and begin the work anew. The collapse of Elizabeth Crow's empire was not a grand cinematic explosion of justice, but rather a slow, agonizing dissolution that mirrored the very shadows she had inhabited. As the mid-9th century began to shift under the weight of civil unrest and changing legal tides, the rigid system of shadows she had built began to suffer from the same entropy that claims all structures built on fear. The end came when the cumulative weight of small individual acts of defiance finally reached a tipping point. It started with a single ledger stolen from one of her front companies by a clerk who had seen his own family vanish years prior, and ended with a coordinated, albeit quiet, withdrawal of the social and economic support that had made her untouchable. Yet, as the law finally closed in on her estates, they found nothing but an empty house and a chillingly organized collection of records, a library of human vulnerabilities. Elizabeth Crow herself vanished into the fog of history, leaving behind a legacy that was not a grave but a blueprint. She proved that while a predator can be displaced, the architecture of domination she leaves behind is a permanent scar on the psyche of civilization. The true horror of the Crow legacy is that her methods did not die with her disappearance. They were merely rebranded for a more sophisticated era. Part 5 explores the eternal blueprint, the unsettling reality that the psychological mechanisms perfected in the cotton fields of the 1800s are the same ones operating within modern corridors of power. Today we see her influence in the way information is weaponized to create perpetual ambiguity, in the subtle art of cancel culture, where social compliance is enforced through the fear of isolation, and in the corporate hierarchies that use data to map human weakness with the same surgical precision Crow once used with her ledgers. We live in an age of invisible chains where algorithms and social pressures function as the new informants, policing our thoughts and behaviors before we even realize we are being manipulated. The Crow method has evolved from physical capture to digital and psychological containment, proving that the desire to dominate is a persistent thread in the human story, always seeking new technologies to mask its ancient predatory face. This blueprint remains active because it exploits the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human mind: our need for belonging, our fear of the unknown, and our tendency to seek order at the cost of liberty. Modern institutions, whether they be governments, massive corporations, or hidden influence groups, frequently utilize the contagion of fear to ensure a self-policing public. By manufacturing crises and seeding distrust among neighbors, they create a fractured society that is too busy fighting itself to look upward at the architects of the chaos. We see the echoes of the polite mask in the sanitized language of bureaucracy and the respectable veneer of those who profit from global instability. Elizabeth Crowe understood that if you dress systemic evil in the robes of necessity or progress, the world will not only tolerate it, but will actively participate in its maintenance. Her story is a mirror reflecting the hidden mechanisms that shape our present reality, urging us to recognize that the structures of fear and dominance she pioneered are still very much alive, operating just beneath the surface of our civilized world. To survive in a world governed by these invisible blueprints, one must develop a mastery of awareness. The lesson of Elizabeth Crowe is that power is most effective when it is anticipated but unseen. To break the chain, you must first be able to see it. This requires a relentless commitment to critical thinking and a refusal to be paralyzed by the informational exhaustion that predators use to mask their movements. We must learn to identify the signatures of control, the veiled threats, the manufactured silences, and the subtle pressures to conform wherever they appear. Just as the communities of the 19th century eventually found the cracks in Crowe's empire through small acts of individual agency, we too can destabilize modern systems of oppression by refusing to play the role of the unwitting accomplice. Awareness is the only weapon that can penetrate the system of shadows, and the knowledge of history's darkest architects is the first step toward ensuring their methods no longer hold dominion over our future. As we reach the final edge of this descent, the story of Elizabeth Crowe stands as both a warning and an invitation. It is a warning that the monsters of history are rarely the ones who scream, but the ones who organize, calculate, and manipulate behind masks of propriety. It is an invitation to reclaim the sovereignty of your own mind from the architectures of fear that seek to inhabit it. Tonight, as the shadows settle, remember that you have seen the unseen. You have decoded the mechanisms of a terror that hoped to remain forgotten. And in doing so, you have transformed your perception of the world you thought you knew. The abyss has looked back at you, and you have walked away with the dangerous knowledge of how power truly operates. Carry this vigilance forward into the light, for in a world where the shadow knows shadow, the only true liberation is the courage to see through the suit of history and recognize the chains before they are forged. The descent is over, but your observation has only just begun.